The rain in the village of Zabyvenye wasn't just weather. It was an eternal curse. It poured for weeks, turning the unpaved streets into sticky, black mud and the air into an icy, damp chill. The village was drowning in a swamp at the foot of featureless hills, cut off from the world by a flooded river and an impenetrable wall of forest. No road led here, only a path that the spring floods erased from the earth. Mark had come here on an assignment for a magazine. He was looking for material on places of forgotten antiquity, folklore, a way of life that had sunk into oblivion. His phone had lost service 10 kilometers back, and his weathered SUV had gotten stuck for good a kilometer from the outskirts, as if the land itself refused to let him in. He covered the last stretch on foot, sinking ankle-deep in the black muck to the monotonous accompaniment of the rain. He was met by the village elder, a man named Yefim. His face resembled a dried pear, wrinkled, of an earthy hue, with colorless eyes. He nodded silently and gestured for Mark to follow. The village consisted of 24 lopsided huts, their dark windows staring at Mark like blind eyes. No children, no dogs, no chickens. Just the noise of the rain and the squelching of mud underfoot. "It's quiet here," Yefim finally spoke, his voice like the creak of an unoiled door. "Few people. We live by our own ways." "Rules?" "What rules?" asked Mark, filming another derelict log house. "Don't go out after sunset. Don't look out the windows after dark. And don't touch the foreign clay visages." Mark smirked to himself. Village superstitions, he thought. Yefim led him to the largest, though no less dilapidated, hut on the edge. Agafia lived here. Passed a month ago. Place is free. The hut consisted of a single room that smelled of mold, dust, and something else, a sweetish, putrid smell like wilted flowers. In the red corner, where icons are usually hung, on a shelf stood dozens of small figures molded from clay. They had only hints of facial features, pits for eyes, slits for mouths. They were arranged in a strict order, and there wasn't a speck of dust on them. "What are these?" Mark inquired. "Visages," Yefim answered shortly. "Don't touch them." And he left, leaving Mark alone with the wind howling in the stovepipe. Mark spent the evening taking notes by the light of a kerosene lamp. The silence outside the walls was absolute, oppressive. At times, he thought he heard scratching on the walls, but when he approached the sooty glass, he saw nothing but impenetrable darkness. Remembering the elder's warning, he turned away from the window, but curiosity gnawed at him like a hungry beast. And then his gaze fell on the shelf with the clay visages. They were primitive, crude, but in their chaotic arrangement, there was a strange order. He took out his camera to photograph them. The flash illuminated the room blindingly bright. And in that split second, he thought the empty pit-like eyes on one of the visages were looking right at him. With reproach, with knowledge. Mark laughed nervously. A trick of the light and shadow, he told himself. He reached out and picked up one of the visages, the most nondescript one. The clay was surprisingly warm, almost alive. He turned it over in his hands, found nothing special, and put it back, disturbing the original order. At that very moment, a sound came from outside. Not the scraping of a branch, but a quiet, wet slap, as if a clump of mud had fallen from the roof. Then another, and another. Mark froze. Yefim's rules played in his head like an obsessive tune. Don't look out the windows after dark. But he was a journalist. His job was to look. He slowly, very slowly, approached the window, holding his breath. He pressed his forehead against the icy glass, peering into the murk of the night. At first, he saw nothing, only his own pale reflection. Then his gaze focused, and he made out figures in the darkness. Short, stocky. They stood motionless in his yard, about 10 of them, maybe more, and they were all looking at his hut. Their faces were molded from the same black, sticky mud as the village streets. They had no distinct features, only hollows for eyes and mouths. They were enlarged, humanoid versions of those very clay visages. One of them, standing closest, slowly raised its hand and pointed a lump-like finger directly at the window. Directly at Mark. Mark's heart pounded in his chest, demanding he run, scream, hide. He recoiled from the window, put out the lamp, and huddled in the farthest corner, covering himself with an old sheepskin coat. The scraping sounds outside were replaced by a quiet, measured tapping. Someone was methodically dragging a finger over the glass, tracing some kind of pattern. He sat like that, motionless, until dawn. When the first rays of the pale sun penetrated the window, the sounds ceased. Exhausted, Mark crawled to the window and looked out. The yard was empty. No figures, no traces, just even wet mud. But on the glass, on the outside, a symbol was drawn in the mud, an exact copy of that very visage he had handled. That day, the village looked the same as yesterday. Quiet, deserted. He met Yefim, who was silently distributing meager rations by the only well to a few villagers who looked as lifeless as the day before. Their eyes were empty. I saw them. Mark exhaled, approaching the elder. Yefim looked at him with his colorless eyes. Told you not to look. They don't like being looked at or touched. Who are they? Those who were before us, and those who will be after. They are of clay and rain. They are the masters of this land. And we are just the keepers of their visages. While they sleep in the earth, we mold them bodies so they remember their form. You disturb the order. You disturb the peace. Why don't you leave? Mark almost shouted. Where to? Yefim gave a bitter smile. The river won't let us. The forest won't release us. They won't let us go. To be born here is to become a part of this. To die here is to give them your clay. That evening, Mark locked himself in the hut again. He tried to put that visage back in its place, but the order was irrevocably broken. He felt their presence outside. They stood in the darkness, silent and motionless, waiting. He saw their vague shadows through the fog glass. The night was long. The knocking on the walls grew louder, more insistent. It wasn't just fingers now. They were palms slapping against the logs, trying to break through. Through the cracks in the floor, that same sweetish putrid smell began to seep in, only now it was thick, suffocating. Towards morning, he cracked. He decided to run. To hell with the SUV. He would go on foot through the forest, across the river, just to get away from this place. He flung the door open and rushed into the pre-dawn gloom. The rain kept pouring. The mud squelched under his feet, clinging to his boots like thousands of hands. He ran down the only street, not looking back, feeling heavy, eyeless gazes on his back from the dark windows of the huts. He reached the edge of the village, where the path disappeared into the forest, and stopped. At the edge of the woods, between the trees, they stood. Dozens of clay figures. They stood shoulder to shoulder, forming a living, breathing wall. Their featureless masks were turned in his direction. They waited in silence. Mark stepped back. He turned around. From the village, from every door, from around every corner, slowly, unhurriedly, more figures emerged. There were hundreds of them. They surrounded him, closing the circle. He retreated until his back hit the cold, wet wall of the well. The figures approached, making no sound, only the quiet, squelching sound of their steps. One of them, the tallest, stepped forward. It raised its hand, and Mark saw that its fingers were molded from the same clay as its body, but one of them was missing a small piece. The figure pointed at Mark and then at the black water in the well. It wasn't a threat. It was an invitation, a return home. Mark tried to scream, but only a wheeze escaped his throat. He felt the clay under his feet come alive, crawling up his boots, tenacious and cold. It was pulling him down into the earth, into the embrace of the waiting silence. The last thing he saw were the featureless masks leaning over him, and he felt a freezing cold filling his lungs. Not with water, with clay. A month later, a new couple arrived in Zabyvenye, young ethnographers. They were met by Yefim. "It's quiet here," he said, looking at them with his empty eyes. We live by our own ways. Rules. He led them to the hut on the edge. A man lived here. Left a month ago. Place is free. In the red corner, on the shelf, the clay visages stood neatly. Among them was a new one. Its features were slightly more defined, and if one looked closely, one could discern the features of a man named Mark. It stood in strict order, and there wasn't a speck of dust on it. And outside, unceasingly, the rain fell,